This is a tutorial for Lizzie Dress View A. As you can see, it's got a nice stretchy neckline made from elastic. It's got short flutter sleeves and a ruffle at the hem. Just showing you a close-up of how the neckline is constructed. We've created a self tunnel or channel for the elastic to be threaded through. And the sleeves and the hems are clean finished with a double neatened hem. However, if you prefer, you can just overlock and fold once and stitch. And just showing you the cut pieces here. So we've got the skirt panel. So we're going to cut two on the fold. So we've got a front and a back. And same for the skirt ruffles. So we've got a front and a back cut on the fold. This is the bodice. This is the front bodice cut on the fold, and the back bodice is also cut on the fold. The sleeves are cut one pair, so we've got a left and a right sleeve there, and the sleeve ruffles are cut two on the fold. We're going to start making up the skirt first. So these are the skirt ruffles. We want to sew a gathering stitch along the top edge of these ruffles, and you know which is the top edge because it has a nick in the centre. Okay, just showing you at the machine. I'm going to be using a long straight stitch to create my gather, and I'm sewing around about 6mm or 1/4 of an inch from the raw edge. And I'm doing the other ruffle at the same time. So that's 6mm away from the raw edge or 1/4 of an inch. Now I've grabbed one of these skirt panels and I've made sure I know which is the waist edge and which is the bottom edge of the skirt. And I'm matching up the centre nicks of the ruffle and the skirt now and just pinning it together. I'm also going to pin the sides, and then I'm just going to gather the ruffle to fit the skirt in between those pins. So to create these gathers, we're just going to be pulling on one of the threads, one of the gathering threads, so either the top thread or the bottom bobbin thread, it doesn't really matter. And I'm just ruching the fabric along. I'm trying to create really even gather. We don't want sort of clumpy looking gather, we want it really evenly spaced. And I'm doing exactly the same with the other skirt and the other ruffle. So at the moment the front and back are the same. So we'll end up with two of these. So again, just pinning at the centre and the sides and using one of the threads to pull and create those gathers, trying to get really nice even gather. Then we're going to be sewing a 1cm seam, which is 3/8 of an inch. So over to the machine. Now I'm going to start with no gather for about 1 centimetre to 1.5 centimetres, which is 3/8 of an inch to a little bit more than 1/2 an inch. And the reason for that is when we do up the side seams, we don't want to be sewing over any gathers. It doesn't look very good. So we just want a little flat bit at the start and the end. And that will become our side seams. So here I am just stitching a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam. I'm using my snips to squash these gathers down and to just shuffle them along if I feel that the machine presser foot is sort of spreading them out a bit, which it tends to do, and we want to try and avoid that. Otherwise you'll end up with a lot of gather at one end and not enough gather at the other end. Now there are different ways of doing gather. Some people like to sew 2 rows of gathering stitch and sew in between those 2 rows. I don't. I just find that 1 row of gathering thread is sufficient, but you can do it however you like. Okay, and then just again taking my time here and making sure that the gather is really even. It's worth it. The more experienced you get with sewing, the easier it gets, and the more your eye adapts, and you can sort of tell if a seam's being gathered nicely or if it's not very even. So it's worth taking your time here. Okay, and so I've done both skirts now. And if you do not have an overlocker or a serger, you can just zigzag along that edge. It's not as nice a finish as an overlock or a serger stitch, but it's better than nothing. I've got an overlocker, so I've just gone ahead and overlocked those seams, and I've pressed the seam allowance upwards. Now, I'm taking the two skirts, I'm putting right sides together, and I'm going to sew the side seams, which will be a 1 centimetre seam, which is 3/8 of an inch. So over to the machine and sewing. I'm just using the guides on my machine to sew 1 centimetre. And just making sure that they're lining up nicely. And just zooming down the side seam. I'm going to take care as I go over the ruffle seam to make sure that the seam matches and that the seam allowance is pointing up and not twisted. Okay, and I've overlocked those side seams. Now I'm showing you where to do a gathering stitch along the waist edge. So like what we did before with a ruffle, we're going to use a long stitch length and we're sewing about 6 millimeters away from the waist edge, which is 1/4 of an inch. I'm stopping and starting at the side seams because it's easier to it's just easier to gather that way as opposed to one long gather all around. While I'm at the machine, I'm going to finish the ruffle hem. So this is the ruffle hem that I'm about to sew now. I have just double folded it towards the wrong side of the fabric, and it's going to finish around about 5 millimeters or a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch. And I'm just taking my time to poke any little frayed bits in. Saves me having to go around and clip them later. And I'm just turning this with my fingers, which if you've cut the ruffle on the straight grain, it shouldn't be too hard to do. Fabric, when it's cut on the straight grain, is quite easy to double turn. But if you've got a folding foot, you can by all means use that. And if you think this looks a bit fiddly, you can just overlock that edge, turn it up 1 centimetre and stitch instead of that clean finish. Right, so this is our skirt. It's actually ready to sew onto the bodice now. So I'm just going to leave it aside and start on the bodice. So these are the, what are they? They are the sleeve ruffles. We're going to sew a gathering stitch along the top edge. And like we did before, we're going to be sewing 6 millimeters down from the raw edge using a long stitch length. So that's number 1 frill, or ruffle. This is number 2 ruffle. Then we can join them up to the sleeve panels. So I've got a pair of sleeves. I'm going to take one of the ruffles. I'm going to find the center neck and I'm going to match it to the center neck of the sleeve. And I'm just going to pin that together. Then I'm going to pin the sides. So the sides match a centimetre up from the edge, or 3/8 of an inch up from the edge. And I'm just gathering the ruffles to fit the sleeve. And then I'm doing exactly the same for the other sleeve. So finding that centre neck, matching it to the centre neck of the sleeve, pinning it together, and then I'm going to pull on one of those gathering threads, and so that the sleeve ruffle fits the sleeve. taking my time to make sure that I've got really nice even gather. And then I'm going to sew a 1 centimetre seam, which is 3/8 of an inch. Okay, and over to the machine. So sewing 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch, doing exactly the same as what I did before, using my snips to help me get a really nice even gather, squashing those gathers down so that they don't spread out. And just taking my time to do a really nice job there. Okay, so that's sleeve number 1. And doing exactly the same for sleeve number 2. Then I've overlocked those seams and I've pressed the seams upwards. Now I've got the back bodice here and I'm matching the back of the sleeve to the back bodice. Now you can tell the back of the sleeve because it has a double neck and it is higher than the front. So I'm going to pin both sleeves onto the back bodice, matching those double necks. And I'm going to sew a 1 centimetre seam, which is 3/8 of an inch. Okay, at the machine, just sewing that 1 centimetre seam, taking care as I go past the ruffle seam. I want that seam allowance pointing upwards. Then I'm doing the other sleeve to the other side of the back bodice. And it's a bit easier when you go from the underarm up to the neck to ensure that that seam allowance is pointing the right way. Then I've overlocked those seams and now I can add the front bodice. So the front bodice has a single neck on that raglan seam, which matches up to the sleeve. So I'm just going to pin those together and sew a 1 centimetre seam as well, which is 3/8 of an inch. And again, just mindful of the direction that the ruffle seam is pointing. It should be pointing up towards the neck, which is easy when you're going from the underarm to the neck edge. And I'm doing the other side, so I'm going down from the neck edge to the underarm, and I'm just making sure that that seam allowance on the sleeve is pointing the right way. Okay, and then I can overlock those seams as well. And now I've gone to the press and I've just pressed those seams in towards the centre back and centre front. And here I am showing you the side seam and the undersleeve seam. So we want to sew that in one continuous seam. So I'm pinning the underarms together and I'm making sure that that seam allowance is pointing down towards the waist. Right, so we're going to sew 1 centimetre seam or 3/8 of an inch in a continuous seam. So we start here, I'm starting at the cuff edge. I'm going through the underarm seam and down to the waist edge. And do exactly the same on the other side. It doesn't matter if you start at the waist or at the cuff edge, just as long as those seams are pointing in the correct direction, which is down towards the waist edge. Okay, I have overlocked those seams and then I've gone back to the sewing machine and now I am doing the sleeve hem. So exactly the same as what you did for the skirt hem. I am double turning that sleeve edge to finish around about 5mm, which is a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch. So you can do it as tiny as you like if you want to do it super, super tiny, or if you've got a special foot, you can do that. And if you don't want to double turn it, you can overlock it, turn it up 1 centimetre and just stitch through it. But I do find with ruffles, this small hem looks really nice. Okay, and I'm making sure that my side seams are pointing towards the back of the garment. The general rule with garment manufacture is side seams point towards the back of the garment, and it's a good habit to get into to always do that. Just the finishing of your garment is just a lot nicer when you come to press it. Alright, so those are the sleeve hems finished. Now I've given it a nice press. Now we're going to make the tunnel or channel for the neck elastic. What I've done here is just trimmed off the excess seam allowance poking up on the front raglans. And here I am just double turning the neck edge and pinning at those raglan seams. You could pin the whole way around. I actually don't find that particularly easy. I find it much easier just to turn as I go at the machine. It's entirely up to you. But I definitely find it helps if you have pinned the 4 raglan seams. Just helps you make sure that you're not stretching the neckline out too much when you're sewing. So we're going to create a tunnel for the elastic. We want the tunnel to, so we're turning about 6 millimeters and then a centimeter, and we're stitching roughly 8 millimeters away from the edge of the tunnel. Now I might have that slightly wrong actually. It might be 8 millimeters and 7 millimeters. So we want, in any case, we're using 6 millimeter wide elastic, which is 1/4 inch wide elastic, and we need the tunnel to finish a little bit bigger than the elastic. So just double check before you start sewing this that your elastic is going to pass through that tunnel easily but not too loose. We want a fairly firm tunnel for the neckline gather to look good. So it's not very easy to press this tunnel before you sew. I think you'll find that quite tricky. It's much easier to turn the fabric without it being pressed first. It just gives you flexibility with how the fabric moves as you sew it. If it's already pressed, it's first of all it's hard to press, and then it's hard to sew as well. I have left a 1 centimeter gap in that tunnel because I need to thread the elastic through. We're going to do that right at the end though. Right now we're going to join the bodice to the skirt. So I am turning the bodice inside out and I'm keeping the skirt with the right side out. I've just found the waist nicks on the bodice and the skirt and I'm matching them up and pinning them. Now I'm also going to pin the side seams. We want our side seam allowance to point towards the back of the garment. Okay, so now we've got 4 pins in the waist and we're going to use those gathering threads just to ruche that fabric in nice and even right round the skirt. And then we're going to sew a 1 centimeter seam, which is 3/8 of an inch. There's a lot of gather in this style, so it's good practice if you haven't done much gathering, and yeah, can be a bit challenging for a complete beginner, but I do think this pattern could be tackled by a beginner. I've called it advanced beginner or experienced beginner, which means you've sewn a few garments before. It's not you do have some sewing skills. I just think that the double turned neck tunnel and the sleeve and hems just probably a little bit tricky for a complete beginner. But if you're adventurous, go for it. Alright, so I have sewn that waist seam 1 centimeter, I've overlocked it and I've pressed it up towards the neckline. So you can see this dress really taking shape now. And we're now ready to put in the elastic. So if you have a look at the pattern or in the spec that's included in the bundle, you'll find the cut measurement depending on what size you're making. And then we're going to use a safety pin, attach it to one end of the elastic, and then start threading the elastic through the neck tunnel. and it can be a bit tricky to get through the when you pass the raglan seams. Sometimes it's tricky to get your safety pin through the tunnel. It's sort of you need to find the gap, and sometimes you're sort of hitting a dead end, so to speak. So just persevere with that. A solution could be to create a slightly wider tunnel, but a wide tunnel with a narrow elastic just does not look good. So just persevere, and patience is my advice when it comes to threading the elastic through. Right, so I've caught the two ends together. I'm making sure that the elastic is not twisted inside the tunnel. That can look pretty horrible. And I'm just trying to get that elastic, the gather created by the elastic, looking quite even. Now I've overlapped the two edges just 1 centimetre, and I'm just using a needle and thread to join those together. This narrow elastic is a little bit tricky to sew together, but you're welcome to do that if you prefer. And then I'm just going to close up that tunnel back at the machine. Just closing up that small gap there. And then we're done. So it's a pretty simple style. There's a lot of gather, and there's a couple of things that are probably a little bit tricky for a complete beginner. But if you've sewn a few garments before, you should be able to tackle this one. And it's just a close-up of the finished neck elastic. So it's a really nice finish. The sleeve hems look really lovely and clean finished. And this is the alternative construction. This is view B that I made using 100% double cotton gauze, which is quite a spongy, thick fabric. So to double turn the neckline and the cuffs is just is a little bit too thick. So I've just overlocked the edges, turned once and stitched to create the tunnels for the elastic. And at the hem, again, I've just overlocked the edge, turned once and stitched 1 centimetre. So that's an easier construction if you prefer to do it that way. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. You can head over to my Etsy store to view this pattern and my other patterns for children's wear and women's wear.